Ralph Lauren, Urban Outfitters, Paul Frank. Dr. Adrienne Keene is a member of Cherokee Nation and a postdoctoral fellow at Brown University, whose passion for addressing the misrepresentation and appropriation of Native cultures has led her to take on those fashion giants. Her work has been published in academic and mainstream media outlets, and her blog, nativeappropriations.com, puts a spotlight on the variety of ways mainstream US culture marginalizes and misrepresents Native people, minimizes their oppression, or straight up rips off their ideas. Dr. Keene's blog is a frequently cited resource in social media, not to mention an invaluable resource that I've incorporated into some of my classes. If you've been in my Honors 101 class, you read her blog. If any of you are curious about why dressing up like a Pocahontas for Halloween is problematic, or what the big deal is with a certain football team's name and mascot in Washington, you need to check out her blog. Seriously, it's nativeappropriations.com. It's clever, irreverent, smart, and really, really funny. Dr. Keene's scholarly work focuses on examining obstacles Indigenous students face in our educational system and developing ways of supporting these students as they navigate higher ed. She's written a great deal about representations of Indigenous people in pop culture and fashion, and courageously speaks up when she sees Native artists' work being ripped off or Native people being misrepresented or dehumanized. A striking characteristic of all of her work is that it is wise and analytical, while also deeply compassionate. It is my great honor to introduce Dr. Adrienne Keene to the Lasell College community.
Thank you so much for that lovely intro. Sio Nagada, Adrian Keene Dawado, Chichalagi, Dalonigea de la Jutla Chinela. Hi everyone, I'm Adrian Keene. I am a citizen of the Cherokee Nation. I'm originally from California, and the way that you say California in Cherokee is yellow money from the ground, which refers to the gold rush, which I always like. So let's see. If our clicker works. Okay, so the plan for today is we're going to talk a little bit about cultural appropriation and representations more broadly, how those play out in pop culture and fashion specifically, because I know a lot of folks here are interested in fashion and fashion design. And then we'll touch on Halloween, because I know that that is coming up, and things that we want to talk about and give you some language to be able to talk about it with your peers. I have so much animation, so it's going to be annoying for you. So click through like 4. Okay, so we'll definitely focus on why it matters, and I'll give you some examples from psychology research and from other Native scholars who've talked about it to talk about why it matters. Okay, so what this is what happens when you Google image search Native American. And I like to use this slide because I feel like it's pretty striking. So if we look at the imagery here, the biggest thing that you might notice is that largely, overwhelmingly, these are images of men. So there are not Native women represented in this at all, except for one photo down here in the corner. And that largely they are photos of folks in traditional regalia, and traditional regalia that comes from a very small number of tribal communities. So this sort of headdress that you see here, the sort of buckskin and the braids, that actually is representative of only a handful of tribes throughout the United States. So to me, this is really interesting and kind of sets the context of what we're thinking about when we think about Native representations. This is what happens in 2015 when you Google Native American. We don't get contemporary images. We don't get anything that represents the diversity of Native peoples in America. We get these largely stereotypical sort of Hollywood Indian images. So the one exception on this page is this one down in the corner down here, and that is actually a still from the Miss Indian World competition, which happens at the Gathering of Nations powwow every year in New Mexico. And it's the largest powwow in the US, and it's this incredible, I hate to even call it a pageant because it's so different than a typical beauty pageant, but it's Native women who represent their cultures and their communities, and they do traditional language and dances and represent their culture in amazing ways. So that picture is down there, but if you didn't know what you were looking at, you would have no idea. So this is what most of America thinks of when they think of Native peoples. And so where do these kind of stereotypes and images come from that inundate us so much that this becomes the norm for Native people? So now I have a bunch of images, which I'm going to make Jesse click through, that represent sort of where I came from with starting my blog, what the sort of images were that really became problematic to me. And a lot of these will probably look very familiar. They're things that we see everywhere and we see every day. And I think when you start to see them all stacked up, it creates this narrative of Native peoples. So first up, we've got the guy in the back there. Let's see if I can, so then you can see better and I can see better. So we have a sacred headdress on a skull, on, I guess, a hipster. But headdresses are something that are extremely sacred to Plains communities, and definitely not something that you would associate with death either. So next is Lego. We got this little guy with war paint and beads and bow and arrow. Next. One that we'll talk a little bit more about. So this is sexy Native American Indian, and I'll read the description for you. Play Pocahontas in this sexy Native American Indian costume, and John Smith might give back Manhattan. Put the wow in powwow and party on. So we'll talk more about that. Lone Ranger and Tonto. I wrote a ton about this movie on my blog. I think I have like 7 or 8 posts about it. And Johnny Depp's portrayal of Tonto. That comes from What Makes the Red Man Red, which is a song in Peter Pan, which was something that I think every child in America has seen many, many times. And my mom is a 2nd grade teacher, and she did not even think about the levels of problematic of that until much later in her life when she was showing it to her kids and then heard them singing it later on the playground. And she was like, what was I thinking? Stanford Indians. So I went to Stanford undergrad. We used to be the Indians until 1971 as our mascot, and it was changed due to student activism. So Indian mascots are something that are still a very big issue and something that I still can't believe is still acceptable. But I write a lot about mascots. This is a book that teaches kids how to play Indian, and it kind of mixes together like all the different tribes, and it tells you how to make a teepee out of like a canvas drop cloth and how to make these outfits out of paper bags, and the language is all in past tense, and again, mixes together a lot of the communities, and this is something that's available in your local library. Cherokee Red Soda. If you walk away with one piece of knowledge from this presentation, know that Cherokee people never wore headdresses. So all the folks who defend their offensive costumes by saying they have Cherokee ancestry, Cherokees do not wear anything that looks like that. So firewater whiskey and bourbon. Next one is a teepee for your cat. Baking powder, iPhone games. Eskimo Joe's is a restaurant in Stillwater, Oklahoma. And this one is Trail of Tears fireworks. So this was sold in Connecticut a couple of years ago. It's a company based in China, but still something that was sold here in the US. And so I hope I don't need to go into detail about why that would be problematic. And lastly, I wanted to end with that image because it's one that we see on TV multiple times a week, especially during this time of year, something that has caused a lot of controversy. This is the logo of the football team in Washington, for those of you who are football fans, the name of which I don't even like to say because I consider it a racial slur. So this is the context. These are the images that, if you start to think about it, you can probably think of hundreds more that you have just come across in your everyday life that you see. And the portrayals of the Native peoples in these are very kind of stock stereotypes of Indigenous peoples. So, next slide, please. So it brought me to, all of this kind of context brought me to wanting to start my blog. And to give the backstory of it, I started it in 2010 when I was a first year, well, end of 2009, early 2010. I was a first year graduate student at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. And I had come from California, where I was at Stanford, and there was a very large and supportive Native community on campus. We had almost 250 Native students on campus, which is a ton. So anytime that there was an incident on campus, anytime something came up, there was enough of a community that we could come together and we could make change. I was never the only Native student in my class. There was always someone else I could kind of rely on, could talk to about the issues. We had multiple Native faculty, still not enough, but we had some on campus. And then I got to the East Coast, and all of a sudden I was surrounded by classmates who told me to my face that they had never met a Native person before, that they thought Native people were extinct, that they didn't think there were any more Natives on the East Coast. And I didn't have any Native faculty, my syllabi didn't have Native people on it, so it was just this experience of total invisibility and erasure. And I was deeply invested in wanting to research issues that were important to my community, important to Native communities, and my classmates just didn't get it, why that was something that would still be important today. And then one day, I went across the street, and there's a huge Urban Outfitters across the street from our campus, and it was the very start of these sort of tribal trends in fashion, the resurgence of them. And in the bargain basement was every stereotype you could imagine. There were these like totem pole jewelry stands and neon dream catchers and like headdress t-shirts and feather earrings, all just fake moccasins, all just displayed for anyone to buy. And something kind of clicked, and I realized that the reason my classmates had such a hard time understanding my experience as a Native person, the issues and communities that I cared about, was the only images they ever saw were like the ones in Urban Outfitters, like the ones that I showed you. So it wasn't any wonder to me that they had such skewed perceptions of contemporary Native people if these were all the images they ever saw. So I decided it was a problem and that I wanted to do something to write about it. So I started the blog, and this is what it used to look like back in 2010, and that's my very first post, called It Started with a Trip to Urban Outfitters. And it's kind of reflective of my state of mind during that time. It's really like dark and a little like emo, but I also didn't really know what I was talking about then either. It was a major process of me learning about these issues. I didn't come into it with some huge base of knowledge. It was a process of learning. So. Now it looks like this, 5 years later, much more brighter. And in that 5 years has really been a process, like I said, of learning, of growing, of opening it up to being kind of a larger community conversation where we don't just talk about the issues of representation, but also talk about their broader implications and what it means for us as Native people and the way that we're perceived in society overall. And I also have a Facebook community that has grown and grown and grown and continues to blow my mind that there are over 100,000 people who want to talk about these issues and are sharing links and sharing discussion points about this. So for Native people, the kind of broad categories that we have of these stereotypes that are reflected in those images that I showed you, reflected in that Google image search as well, there's a First Nations writer who used this 4 Ds that I kind of like because it is very dramatic and in your face, but the 4 Ds are drums, dancing, drinking, or dead. So if you start to think about the last time you saw Native peoples in the newspaper or on the news, it kind of tends to fall into these 4 categories. So it's either historic, ancient Native peoples artifacts that were found, or it's some sort of pageantry with a local powwow, or some sort of dancing or conversations about alcoholism or poverty or things like that. It's not a lot outside of that for contemporary representations. And then for Native men, we tend to have these 2 stereotypes, or we have the savage stereotype more broadly, and that falls into 2 categories of either the sort of noble savage who is the very connected to nature and stoic warrior who like wants to help the white settlers and it's just very sort of noble. And then the ignoble savage is the wild-eyed, sort of tomahawk-wielding, wants to kill and scalp everyone stereotype. And then for Native women, we are really put into this very overly sexualized category. So it tends to be this sort of Indian princess or sexy, another word that I don't even like to say, that takes away the agency of Native women, that ignores the history of our matriarchal societies, and that women held almost all of the power in most Native communities prior to contact. And then in our communities, we have major issues with the sexualization of Native women and sexual violence against Native women. Thank you. So when we have things like the sexy Native American Indian or the Pocahontas costume, it continues this this perception that Native women are kind of free for the taking, that we're these sexualized beings, and it contributes to these cycles of violence against Native women. But the biggest one is invisibility. And so for Native people in every sector of society, we are not represented. And if we are represented, we're misrepresented. So that invisibility is something that really carries through. Like if you think of TV today and all the shows that you watch, there are literally 0 Native characters. Parks and Recreation had a Native character who I actually think is a great portrayal. Then Law and Order SVU had a Native character. But these are like 1 out of every TV show that's on the air. So that invisibility becomes really real. And this ties into stereotyping. So when I'm talking about the diversity of Indian country and these 567 federally recognized tribes, each of those tribes has their own language, their own culture, their own history, their own tribal government, their own homelands, and that is completely erased by these images. As I've said over and over, it sets us in the historic past and therefore erases our contemporary existence. So oftentimes when we're looking at textbooks or the text that you're reading for your courses, it puts Native peoples in the past, in past tense. It doesn't talk about us in contemporary or modern terms. And then a large problem is that then these images become real Indians to people. So when I then assert my Native identity and say, hey, as a Native person, I'm not comfortable with you wearing that costume for Halloween or with you using that aspect of my culture in your fashion design, people dismiss it because I don't look like those images, so I can't possibly be a real Indian. And Native identity is something that is very complex and complicated. And in the US, it's a racialized identity, so we're considered a race, but it's also very much a political identity. And you heard I introduced myself as a citizen of the Cherokee Nation. And we're citizens of sovereign nations. And so that identity is very different than a racialized identity. And they both go together to create what it means to be a Native person. But when the only images you see are these stereotypes, it erases that diversity and that nuance and replaces in people's mind what a real Indian is, and therefore takes away our authority and ability to speak back on those issues. So now that leads to cultural appropriation. So I promise I have more images for you in a minute. This is the academic-y part. So at the most basic level, cultural appropriation is taking from a culture that is not one's own intellectual property, cultural expressions and artifacts, history, and ways of knowledge. And this comes from a First Nations writer in Canada. And that, on its most basic level, is pretty straightforward and also not exactly problematic. What we get into is that there's actually layers of power and systems of power that are in place that make this problematic. So when people talk about the harms of cultural appropriation, people often dismiss this kind of stuff as being like, it doesn't really matter, it's not a big deal, like what are you so worked up about, it's just fashion or art or culture, whatever. But I've kind of divided it into 2 halves that can help people think through it. And the first is the economic arguments of the harms of this. And these are ones that people tend to have a little bit easier time wrapping their heads around, because in our capitalistic society, we understand money, we understand economic arguments, we understand things like intellectual property. So that's the biggest one, so if we think about a brand, if we think about a fashion brand like Louis Vuitton or something that has a very recognizable logo, that's protected under law. That's intellectual property of the company. So if someone else decides to make a design using that logo, they can be prosecuted under the law. But that protection does not apply to like non-Western cultures or to Native peoples or other indigenous peoples or basically anyone besides white Western European sort of folks. And that has never really been seen as a problem. And to me, I wonder, why is that? Why is it seen that our intellectual property, our knowledge is not protected in the same way? And there's also this piece of trademark and copyright. So in the case of the Navajo Nation, they've actually trademarked their name, Navajo, in conjunction with textiles or clothing or things like that. Back in the 1970s, they were very proactive with this. So in 2011, when Urban Outfitters released a whole line of products that were named Navajo, they actually sued them. And the lawsuit is still ongoing, but they had that trademark on their name to be able to say, no, this is our property. Like, we are the Navajo Nation, and you can't use that to sell your products. There's also something called the Indian Arts and Crafts Act that is a federal law that protects Native artisans, but it's very limited in its protection. So basically what it means is if you are a non-Native artist or artisan and you sell something and say that it is made by a Native person and you are not in fact a Native person, you can be fined under this law. And apparently there's even jail time, though they've never actually jailed anyone under this. But it's very limited in its protections. But the bottom line is that this is a case where the appropriating group is benefiting. They're getting a lot of money off of this. Urban Outfitters is getting money from selling things called Navajo, and the group that it's coming from is not. So when all those products are being sold in Urban Outfitters, that totem pole that is reflective of Northwest Coast communities, those communities aren't getting any of that profit from it. And that goes along the lines with all of this. Then on the other side of things is something that people have a little bit harder time wrapping their head around, and these are the moral and cultural arguments. And so Rebecca Sosi, who is a Navajo lawyer who writes about cultural appropriation, she says that cultural appropriation begins to interfere with the community's ability to define and establish its own identity. So for me, if I am saying these are the things that make me Cherokee, these are the things that I identify with to be a part of my culture. And then all of a sudden that becomes something that anyone can buy at Target or Urban Outfitters. It begins to take away the power of that. And the power of self-representation, the power of self-identity is actually something that is so important to Indigenous communities. It's included in the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People. That's one of the points in there, is the power of self-identity. So cultural appropriation begins to eat away at that. And then a lot of these are sacred aspects of culture. So if we're talking about the headdress specifically, that's something that is reserved for the most revered leaders from those communities. It's something that has to be earned. It's a symbol of respect and of honor, and something that is used in ceremonial practices. And when things like that headdress that are sacred are taken out of context, you're starting to take away that power from it. You're starting to eat away at that sacredness of it. And that's something that should be respected from folks. And as I talked about, this all ties in with stereotyping, because it's really boiling down culture into these sort of stock set of stereotypes and saying that this is what represents a community, and erasing that diversity and nuance and all these words that I keep saying that are important to recognize. And the last piece is this idea of cultural survival, or as Rebecca Sosi calls it, cultural sovereignty. So I talked about that we're citizens of sovereign nations, and what that means is that we have the rights of self-governance. So we have our own tribal governments, we have our own education, we have our own healthcare, tribal police, fire, all of these things. We have the power to have jurisdiction over our own tribal lands. And the piece of that is also very important is cultural sovereignty. So having the power and control over our own cultural practices as well goes right along with that establishing of ourselves as sovereign nations. But the biggest thing with all of this, as I mentioned, is that these are issues of power that we're talking about. And specifically with Native people, you cannot separate this from the long history of colonialism in the United States. So no matter what, this is a group that is in power taking from a group that's in a marginalized position. So it's never going to be this like equal exchange of appreciation or whatever it is. It's always going to be stuck in this system of power. And so that, to me, is why it becomes a very big problem. And so when we're talking about those ties to colonialism, I want you to look at this animated GIF that I love, because I think it shows the dramatic loss of land that Native peoples have experienced. And along with that dramatic loss of land came a dramatic and genocidal loss of life. And in order to justify that, so for the settlers to justify that loss of land and loss of life, Native peoples had to be painted as inferior in every way. We had to be savage, we had to be less than human, we had to be culturally inferior, because otherwise, how could you justify this? How could you say that that's okay and not a problem? So we have images like this, we have images like I was showing you that paint Native peoples as this savage inferior and therefore not worthy of life, worthy of eradication. And so this is the history that we have. And on top of this sort of physical genocide and physical taking of land, we have cultural genocide that occurred simultaneously. So if it wasn't possible to physically get rid of every Native person, then the colonizers decided that we would culturally get rid of Native people, and maybe they could assimilate into mainstream society. And that was done through a concerted effort through a system of Native boarding schools that took Indian kids as small as 3 and 4 away from their families. They weren't allowed to speak their languages, they weren't allowed to wear their traditional clothing, they had their hair cut, they weren't allowed to see their families. And this, the goal of these schools, and it's written down, was to kill the Indian and save the man. And this was seen as something that was like benevolent, like, oh, we're not actually gonna kill you, we're gonna let you live, and it's gonna be great, you're gonna be a functioning member of our society. But so this is the context. So for all of these generations, Native peoples were not allowed to practice our culture. We were not allowed to practice our ceremonies. It was prohibited by law until 1975. That we could not hold religious or spiritual ceremonies. The American Indian Religious Freedom Act was passed in 1975, like that's not that long ago. And so for all this time, we had no power to maintain our culture under these laws and practices, but we did. And so communities have held on to these cultural practices, have held on to our traditions and our traditional regalia and our art and our aesthetics and our designs, even through all of this. But now, all of a sudden, these things that for generations we were told were illegal and we weren't allowed to do and were against progress are suddenly seen as cool and suddenly seen as something that everyone should have access to. And so for us as Native people, that's a really hard thing to understand, a really hard thing to swallow, because we didn't have power and control before, and we still don't. Because now it's not us deciding the ways that people can interact with our cultures, interact with our designs. It's outsiders taking from us and using it however they see fit. So this is the context that we can't separate this from. And I know it seems kind of heavy when you're just trying to think about like Halloween or shopping at Urban Outfitters, but this is what I see when I see those designs in Target or Walmart or wherever. But it also matters on a couple of other levels. Besides the underlying colonialism, this quote comes from Buffy St. Marie, who most college students have no idea who that is. Anyone? The older folks in the room usually do. She is a singer, educator from Canada. She's Cree. She just won the Polaris Prize in Canada, which is the largest music award that they give, and she's like 75, so that's pretty cool. But she said, non-Indian people have very little accurate information about Native American anything, and Native Americans suffer from being misperceived all our lives because of this lack of information. Our history is still fictionalized and exploited, and our contemporary realities are mostly absent from the public eye. It is no wonder Indian people have a hole where self-esteem ought to be. And this is something that's actually quantified by psychological research. So this slide comes from Stephanie Freiberg, who is a Tulalip and Swinomish researcher from Washington State. And she did a study where she exposed Native students and non-Native students to stereotypical Native imagery or a list of stereotypes of Native people. And so, so on the top here, we have American Indian students. And over here on this side is the control. So these were the students who were not shown any imagery and took a self-esteem measure. And then over here we have the students who were shown Pocahontas, the students who were shown Chief Wahoo, who's the mascot of the Cleveland Indians, that like horrible red grinning monstrosity. And then we're read a list of negative stereotypes of Native people. And so what you're seeing here is that for Native students, their self-esteem went markedly down with viewing these. And it's actually statistically significant how much their self-esteem dropped from viewing these. And Pocahontas is considered like a good image, you know, that she's not like wild-eyed, savage Indian, but even that stereotypical image still affected Native students. But the bigger thing that I think is really striking is that for white students, their self-esteem went up with viewing each of these. So the dotted line is the control. It went up, and went up pretty significantly for each of those. And so not only is this harming the self-esteem of Native youth, which is incredibly important because we experience suicide at rates like 2.5 times the national average, up to 12 times the national average in some communities. This is really reifying white supremacy. This is telling white students that they should feel better about themselves by seeing the subjugation of another group. So this is deeper than just it's making Native students feel bad. It is sort of reifying our entire system that we have set up that whiteness is privileged in these spaces. So scientific research also backs this up. This is going to be a little bit hard to read in this light, so I'll summarize it for you. It's a great quotation. It comes from Sunny Singh, and in this article called Turbans on the Runway, What Does It Mean for Sikhs? And it says, the thing about cultural appropriation is the appropriator does not have to face the same consequences that we do for practicing our culture or faith. For them, it is an accessory that can be taken on or off at will, while for us, it is a way of life. I'm not saying cultural or religious garb or practices should not be shared. Culture never exists in a vacuum and is never pure, nor should it be. It's ever-changing, evolving, and growing. But in a society where immigrants and communities of color are marginalized at every level, we can't pretend that power relations do not exist when we have this conversation about appropriation. Sharing and exchanging cultural and spiritual practices is great, but it gets more complicated when we're not all on equal footing. It gets more complicated when meaningful things are taken, commodified, and exploited for a profit with little respect shown to the community they were taken from. So I think that kind of pulls together a lot of these things that I was talking about. So now I want to talk a little bit about fashion and talk about the ways that this plays out. And I have more images for you to show just in the last few years what this has looked like. So this is from the company ASOS, which is a British brand, and it says, "Go native with Aztec and Navajo prints. They invented chewing gum and chocolate, but surely the Aztecs' greatest achievement was inspiring these fresh prints." So besides that description, I do want to point out that Navajo and Aztec are culturally incredibly different, and also that these prints are more almost like Scandinavian to me than tribal, but Hello Kitty wearing a little headdress and war paint there. This is Carly Kloss in the Victoria's Secret runway show a couple of years ago, and this actually was supposed to represent the month of November in the runway. So of course, Indians, November, Thanksgiving, I don't know. But what I want to point out here is we have this plains headdress going on here, which also in communities is usually something reserved for men. So whenever you see women wearing these, it's like a direct disrespect of the sort of gender norms around that in communities. And then we have this like Southwest style squash blossom necklace and concho belt. And then I have no idea where the leopard jaguar print bikini comes in. I'm not sure what community that's traditional to, nor the fringe lucite heels. But this was something that caused enough outrage on the internet that they actually ended up pulling it from the show, which was fantastic. And Carly even ended up apologizing, which she had no control over what they put her in, so I thought that was nice of her. J. Crew with a teepee, and teepees are one people are always like, but it's a tent, like you're being so sensitive. And it goes back to that history of colonialism. We were told that this was the wrong way to live. This was like a backwards thing that we were not allowed to do. Communities weren't allowed to practice their nomadic ways anymore. All the buffalo were slaughtered, all these things. And now all of a sudden, oh, it's a great fun toy for kids. It's something we should all be able to have. So there's history there. These are our kids' moccasins that retail for $350 from House of Harlow, which is Nicole Richie's line. And you can buy some gorgeous moccasins from Native people that cost probably about that much. So that's the big thing that I talk about with these things is I don't want people to not wear Native-inspired things. What I want you to do is to buy it from a Native person. That's it. because Native people, the understanding is that Native designers know how to represent themselves in their community. They know where the boundaries are. They know where things are that can be acceptable for non-Natives to wear versus a outside designer who's benefiting monetarily from this. Tommy Hilfiger, Echo Weekend Warrior, Jeremy Scott for Adidas. This one I have backwards in protest because the front of it, he literally took a totem pole from Canada and just like put it on the outfit without any regard to the story or the family or the community that that came from. That's another one from the line. This came from Nicholas Kay in Fashion Week in 2014. And the outfit itself, besides the feathers, is not anything problematic, but the whole thing was billed as an Apache shamanistic journey. And all the language around it was this like mystical Apache shamanistic thing and feathers found in the hills and weird stuff. So it's not just the outfits themselves, it's the way that they're presented as well. So Ralph Lauren had a line that we called the Winter Catalog of Cultural Appropriation, where he used these images from the assimilation time period. So that time period I showed of the boarding schools, that's where these images come from. And a lot of times they were used to show how wonderfully natives were adapting to Western clothing. And he used them to sell his clothes without talking about who these people were, what communities they come from, anything. And this was 2015, this most recent Fashion Week. On this side is my friend Bethany Yellowtail, who's Crow in Northern Cheyenne. This is her Crow pop dress. The design comes from the beadwork of her family, and she specifically asked if it would be okay to use in her design. There's very specific things in here, like this balance shape here is very specific to Crow, and the top triangle is the spirit world, the bottom triangle is like the underworld, and the middle is where the Crow live. So it's something that is in all of their beadwork and regalia. The colors are very specific. This is Marjan Pajowski, who has a brand called KTZ, just literally took her design, changed it up a little bit, put it down the runway, along with the rest of his line was extremely problematic, taking from Navajo and Lakota and all sorts of other communities. And then he didn't see anything wrong with it, never apologized, dismissed it as not a big deal. So there are 3 S's that come from a scholar named Susan Scafidi, and these are ways that help you evaluate whether or not something is cultural appropriation. And they're guidelines. They're not anything that, I will never give someone a hard line. And I think for people that's hard. They really want to know, like, this is okay and this isn't. But there's not anything like that. The problem with this is it's a lot like talking about racism. We're talking about large sort of institutional level things that exist in society, of power relationships and things like that, that don't have easy yes or no sort of up or down things. And we need to be able to kind of sit with some of that discomfort sometimes. But the 3 S's are source, significance, and similarity. So source is, where is this thing coming from? Is it coming from the community itself? Is it coming from a native or a designer from that community? Significance, is this something that is spiritually significant, sacred, something that I should not maybe be using? And then similarity, is it like Marjan Pajowski where you took the exact thing? Is it vaguely drawing upon some of the aesthetics from it? Just thinking about the actual similarity to the product. And again, those are just guidelines and something to help you think through these things. So I wanted to touch on Halloween just to end. So this is, again, if you search Indian costume, this is what comes up. But of course, this is not something that is reserved for Native communities. There are any number of horrible things that people decide to dress up of this time of year. And I get a lot of pushback with Halloween specifically. And the interesting thing is people do not really have creative ways of challenging this. So the pushback falls into these main categories, and I want to go through them. So for those of you who care about these issues, to maybe help you get some language to talk about it. For those of you who still aren't sure, maybe this will help you a little bit too. So what about Vikings or lederhosen or leprechauns or cowboys? And this goes back to, again, those issues of power. So in our society, there's not an active system of colonialism against Vikings. There's not laws in place that prohibit Vikings from practicing their culture. There's not anything like that for descendants of Vikings, they're not facing this ongoing daily oppression in our communities. And then things like leprechauns, not real, cowboys are an occupation, so not an entire sort of group of people. So that to me is not a strong argument. But I didn't mean it in an offensive way. And this is one that happens all the time. And I hope that we can start to separate intent from this whole conversation, because intent really isn't this like magical thing that erases the pain of the action. So the example that some people like to give online is that if someone like steps on your foot and like totally messes up your toe and they're so apologetic and they didn't mean to step on you and they're so sorry about it, it doesn't take away the fact that your toe is still throbbing and in pain. So the intent of this doesn't erase the hurt. And especially if we're talking about blackface, there's no non-offensive way to do blackface. Like full stop, no nuance there. Like there's no non-offensive way to do blackface because of that legacy and history of blackface being used as a way to subjugate and make fun of African American people in the United States. Like there's no way to separate a contemporary use of blackface from that history. And the same goes for dressing up as an Indian and dressing up as these other communities. But blackface is the one that people tend to stick on. It's an honor. And I hope we can see from this that is not the way to honor any sort of community. To show your respect from it is not by distilling it into stereotypes and dressing up for it on a night when you most likely are imbibing large amounts of alcohol and doing things that aren't respectful of that community. I'm a historic character, I'm Pocahontas, or I'm a fictional character, I'm Jasmine, whatever it is. Pocahontas, so we'll use Pocahontas as the example. Pocahontas in real life was between 9 and 12 years old. She was a prepubescent girl who was not wearing a little sexy one-shouldered outfit with a pretty blue necklace. She was from communities out here on the East Coast and did not even marry John Smith, was kind of sold to John Rolfe in an agreement with the community, went to England and died very young from smallpox. So if you want to dress up as Pocahontas, that's the history that you need to pull off of, not the fictionalized Disney version. And that is probably not as cute or sexy that you want to dress up as for Halloween. But my great-grandma was Cherokee. This one I even got this morning on Twitter from someone. And Cherokee regalia does not look anything like those fake sort of Pocahontas costumes. To me, the way you respect your ancestry and your heritage is by actually respecting it, actually learning about it, not using it as a get-out-of-jail-free card, not using it as something that you pull out only when you've been accused of racism. So to me, I hold people who have Native ancestry to a higher standard, and I believe that in order to really show respect to that heritage and that ancestry, this would be the last thing that you would think of doing. So I challenge those people to educate themselves a little more and think about how they're actually honoring it. This one is another one I've gotten for real. But how come you get to wear white people clothes and speak English? Colonialism. So we'll just go from there. You're being way too sensitive, get over it. And that's, I think, the largest one that everyone gets. And hopefully I've demonstrated that this is not just a low-level thing, it's something that has a lot behind it. And if it's not a big deal, then it shouldn't be a big deal for people to not dress as that for Halloween. So the not a big deal thing goes both ways. And on that note, there's this quotation that I like from this guy named Guante, who's an MC poet. And he says, "It's mind-boggling to me how this debate is always framed as, why shouldn't I be allowed to dress up as a stereotype, as opposed to, why would you want to dress up like a stereotype?" So I think that's an important sort of reframing of it, to think about it in that way. This comes from Hampshire College. It's kind of hard for you guys to see. I feel like it's very similar to a lot of the cool flyers that are up in your bathrooms right now, so I won't even take the time to go through it, but you can Google is your costume racist, and it'll come up. But basically, I like this upper one. Would I be ashamed or embarrassed or ashamed if someone from the group I'm portraying saw me wearing this? Which I think is a good kind of personal check-in. And I'm gonna, in the interest of time, I'll skip through this. It's actually something I wrote out on my blog. It's on there right now. On a post called, "So Your Friend Dressed Up as an Indian, Now What?" So I walk through these steps. So if you go to my blog, it's actually one of the first things that's on there right now. But just how do you think through the conversation that inevitably will happen with a friend if they're dressed up in an offensive costume? And these are kind of the steps that I go through in that process. So with that, I want to end with some of these images from amazing communities who are pushing back on these narratives of Halloween, because I always like to, I realize with my blog, what I do is I tear apart all the negative representations, but I need to be better about giving people representations to replace it with. So if I'm telling you all this doesn't represent Native people, all this doesn't represent communities of color, but then don't give you anything to replace it with, that's not as strong of an argument. It doesn't really move things forward in the way I'd like. So I always try to end with positive images of people engaging in resistance or pushing back. So these all come from various campaigns of culture, not a costume. Most of these come from Ohio State, which were the first ones who made these. And I think they're really beautiful. So you wear the costume for one night, I wear the stigma for life. There's another one from that campaign. And then folks who picked this up and have done sort of viral campaigns on their campuses and with their organizations of being not a costume. Because what it really boils down to is these are your classmates, these are your friends, these are your fellow community members, and this has real and deep effects on our experiences, on their experiences, and so to bring it back to thinking about the people who are involved in this. So with that, I will turn it over for questions. So Wado, thank you.
So you talked about, that's really loud, okay. So you talked about wanting to support Native designers and Native artists. Is there kind of like a websites connecting like Native designers to people who want to purchase their items? Because I know like you type in Native American, whatever, like it's going to come up with a bunch of non-Native designers or artisans. So how do you find and source those designers and artists?
It's almost like I planted you in the audience. That is a question that I often get, and one my favorite resource to point people to. So before when I started this blog, that was I would always end with that call, be like, buy from Native artists, and then people would be like, okay, where do I do that? And I'd have to say, well, you have to be a little resourceful, you have to go to powwows, or you have to like go to communities themselves. But now, my friend Jessica has solved the problem for all of us and created this amazing online boutique called the Beyond Buckskin Boutique. And it's shop.beyondbuckskin.com. And she is a former academic. She used to be a professor. She decided to become an entrepreneur. Her research is on Native fashion. And the amazing thing, this website has grown from like having 3 designers on it to, I think there are like 80, 50 something designers on there. And the price points go from like $10 up into like couture gowns and beautiful, really expensive things. And so it's now created this place where everyone can just go and directly support the Native designers and see the diversity of Native styles and aesthetics. So that's a great resource. She also has an accompanying blog called Beyond Buckskin, and she does designer profiles on there, and a lot of them have their own websites as well. So if she doesn't feature them on her boutique, that's a way to find and connect with them. So the internet has changed the game on all of these conversations. I think when Native people were only 1% to 2% of the population, very hard to have a collective voice on anything when we're so geographically spread out, and social media and the internet has really given us a space to kind of have that voice and to be able to connect consumers directly with Native folks as well. So Beyond Buckskin.
Hi, can you hear me? Okay, so like how would you like bring this to schools that like aren't college, more like elementary and like middle school? Because like for me, growing up in like the 2nd grade, November, everybody's talking about Thanksgiving, and then we learn about the Indians and like we're building teepees and feathers for our head. Then we watch Pocahontas and I'm like, oh my God, she's so cute. Oh my God, I want John Smith to be my bae. But when I'm older, I'm like, oh snap, everything that I thought was supposed to be good, it's not really. But then at a younger age, I'm also taught about slavery and how the blacks and the whites, and I'm like, but I know at a young age, like, oh my God, this is wrong. And I knew from earlier, how do I know it's wrong? Well, how do you teach the younger, the little bees, that it's wrong at their younger stage?
Yeah, I think the big thing, so I mentioned my mom is, I don't know if I mentioned you guys, but my mom is a second grade teacher. So for her, these are conversations we have all the time because the actual curriculum that she's given is horrible. And she's in California, which is like relatively progressive in some things, but for her, it's a constant challenge of being age appropriate, but also wanting to the students to understand the real legacies of all of this and to give them the correct information. So the big thing that she tries, so she is supposed to teach about Columbus Day. She does not. She teaches instead about Indigenous Peoples Day. She mentions Columbus as a guy who many people say discovered America, but we all know that Indigenous people were here first and have been here and are still here. And so she just constantly is reframing the narratives for her students. And when they talk about Thanksgiving, the biggest thing that she wants them to understand is that it's not generic Indians, it's the Wampanoag people, and she shows them on the map like where they are and talks about their community and has a couple of children's books that actually do tell like about the Wampanoag. Because the whole narrative of Thanksgiving is a complete fiction. Like there wasn't like a day where everyone sat down and like had this big meal. Like timeline-wise, it doesn't make sense. You wouldn't be big harvesting during the middle of November in New England. Like that is not a thing. So she doesn't necessarily go into that whole thing, but make sure that the students are aware that it's an actual community that has a real name, that they still exist today, and that they were the ones who basically saved the Pilgrims' butts, is like her big thing, is that the Pilgrims would not have survived if it weren't for the local Native people. So she picks very specific kind of goals for her students that they can understand. But it's really about how do we get every teacher to do that? How do we get everyone to understand that? Because it's very easy for folks to fall back on we're going to show Pocahontas, we're going to build a teepee, and that's Native American Week. Because all of us have been raised in this society that doesn't talk about those nuances. So it's a matter of unlearning what we've been taught and being able to share with our younger siblings or cousins or students that we come in contact with and really start that process of re-educating.
And if anybody would be interested in getting a social justice link credit by going to a school and giving a presentation and educating, or the barn, come see me. I'd be happy to offer that.
Hi. I just wanted to know how you feel about the infamous Twilight Saga and how natives are like represented in that movie.
So the question of Twilight. So it's really interesting because when it first came out, I will openly admit there was this sort of like excitement where I was like, oh my God, there are native characters, they're main characters, they like have names, they are like part of this community. People recognize that they have like ties, ancestral ties, but they're like still modern people, and like one of them's a main love interest. Like, wow, this is cool. And then I started reading it, and it's not cool. And one of the main problems is the tribe that is portrayed in the books is a real tribe. So these representations that, what's her name, Stephanie Meyer? Yeah. That she basically like made up this story of the like vampires and the wolves and the treaty was completely fictional. And now it's being associated with a real tribal community, and it's like a total manipulation of their cultural practices. And then, of course, so the native characters turn into animals. So there's this immediate connection with like being less than human, like being subhuman, being tied to this like savage. They can't control themselves a lot of times. Like Jacob can't control when he transforms. Like he gets angry, and then all of a sudden he like becomes the werewolf. And so it's this again stereotype of the like hot-headed sort of savage beast. And then the language like around Jacob and Bella, and I can't believe I'm going so in depth, and you can tell I've read all these books, is that it's really, I read it, to problematize it, critique it, but there's not a lot of language of consent with him and Bella. Like, he is very much like really aggressive and like and so to me, again, all of these sort of things that are coming out of the character, coming out of this fiction, are then applied to Native peoples more broadly because we don't have any other representation. So these were the only Native characters in recent memory that kind of made such a big splash in literature, and they have all these really problematic stereotypes. And then in the casting of the film, they cast a non-Native guy as like the main Native. He made up some Native ancestry in order to get the role, and like the real Native actors were like the background ones, and so there's that too. But yeah, so to me, it was something that could have been really cool because there are so few Native portrayals, but then clearly just fell back into these really problematic tropes of Native men. And then the only Native woman that you know is Emily, and she like is in this very like subservient kind of role and is like scarred by her man and still stays with him because that's just what he does and stuff like that. So lots, could write a whole dissertation on the portrayals in Twilight.
Okay, so my question is, how would you want literary characters or people in TV shows to be represented if it's not like overgeneralizing, okay, overgeneralizing their culture, but still staying true to it without, like, I don't know what I'm trying to ask, like making fun of it almost, like, or like to get people to like not, oh, that's just their culture, that's just like that.
Yeah, I think that's a good question. And what I want is I want like the characters to just happen to be Native. Like it doesn't, I want there to be Native teachers and lawyers and doctors and love interests and everything, every sort of portrayal that non-Native people get in the media. I want there to be able to be Native roles for that because the Native identity, and I think a good example of that is Adam Beach's character on Law & Order SVU, Chester Lake. And are you guys familiar with that show, that character? So he's just another detective like on the force, and there are certain ways that his culture like comes out, and it's very specific. Like he is a Mohawk man, and it talks about that, and it talks about his ancestors were the ones who helped build New York City, which is true, that Mohawk iron workers were a huge part of building all of the skyscrapers in New York. So there's these subtle ways that his heritage comes out in the show, but it's not by any means the primary sort of thing that drives his character. There's not the flute music that comes on every time he comes on screen. Like he's not like listening to the ground to like hear which way the guy like ran away or whatever. He's just like a modern Native guy who has this history, has this ancestry, but it doesn't drive the thing. But it's there to build the character, so he's not a generic Indian. He comes from a specific background and community. The only thing that makes me really sad about that character is he was so great, and then on the way they had him exit the show was by like going crazy. Like he shot people and like ran away, and just like this whole like explosion of almost like savagery in my mind. Like it would have been great if they just sort of transitioned him off the show rather than have him go out guns blazing, which to me brought back a lot of the stereotypes that they've been so good at breaking down with the character. So that's what I hope for, is that it doesn't have to be part of the joke, it doesn't have to be the whole storyline, that they just can be people in these roles.
Amy?
Yeah, so I just wanted to know for like kind of different stereotypes for high school spirit week. There's a day called Dress Like a Nerd Day, and I wanted to know, like, for some people it's offensive to dress like a nerd, and for others it's not. And I wanted to know, like, how do you kind of cross that line between overgeneralizing a stereotype and just kind of maybe not doing that, like not being offensive to someone and overgeneralizing?
That's That's a good question, and it's definitely one that I haven't thought through deeply about, like nerd specifically. So I don't know if I can speak perfectly intelligently to that, but I think the challenge with any of these sort of like Spirit Day things, there's a lot of different ones that can be problematic. Like there's often the Cowboys and Indians Day, there's like often Hawaiian Day, or any of these things that do sort of generalize an entire group of people into these sort of stock stereotypes. And I think it'd be a good place for conversation in that school environment to see, like, are there students that are deeply hurt by that portrayal of nerds? And if there are, then that needs to be a conversation that's had of what are the ways that we could change this to be something that isn't hurtful. Because I think the biggest thing is you want to listen to folks from that community. So if there are people who identify as nerds that are feeling very hurt by those portrayals, then that's who we need to be listening to. And it's a little bit different because I think a lot of the mainstream representations of like nerddom are of folks that aren't necessarily from like marginalized communities, but how do we talk about, is there a nerd culture that we're talking about? Like, so it's definitely something that I would direct back to folks who are concerned about the portrayals and just listen and see what would make them comfortable.
So what are your thoughts about honoring a community if you are outside of a community, if you are inspired by Native people and the beauty that they really bring to this country? So what's intelligent about that?
So the question was if you really are inspired by Native American cultures, communities, and want to honor that, what's a way of going about that? And I think, like with Beyond Buckskin, there's ways to incorporate Native design and aesthetics into your wardrobe that are perfectly acceptable. And then I love the part of that I really like as well is the conversations that then come out of it. So if someone compliments you on whatever you're wearing or asks about it, then you can say, this is from so-and-so designer who's from so-and-so community, and it again starts to break up that mass of like the one Native American everything. So you can say like this is a Navajo cuff made by Erica Lee, who is like a Navajo silversmith from Ganado, Arizona. So that becomes a conversation point. And then I think the biggest way, in my mind, to honor Native peoples and our contributions is to give Native peoples a platform and support Native creators in doing whatever it is that they do. So I think oftentimes people like authors or designers want to honor Native peoples and their respect for them, but they don't invite Native people to the table to do it with them. So collaboration and relationships are the two things that I push for everything. So if you want to pull on Native aesthetics in your newest fashion line, invite a Native designer to do it with you and work together. If you want to write a book that has Native characters, invite Native people to write with you, work with you, to read your texts and compensate them, pay them to do that, rather than seeing yourself in a role that you can honor by portraying without inviting people sort of to the table. So I never want folks to walk away and be like, well, I'm not going to interact with Native people ever again and never do anything, because I think the biggest thing is just opening up the conversations for collaboration and giving the power back to Native peoples to represent themselves in the ways that we see fit.
So I have a question about the graph that you were showing us about the self-esteem.
Mm-hmm.
So how exactly did that work? Like, did everyone just get a self-esteem quiz or talk about like something like this and then get one after? Like, I just find that so interesting that there was a blatant, obvious increase in European American versus Native people. So, like it was so obvious. There's no way you could be confused by that.
Yeah, so the way the experiment was set up, they didn't know what they were there for. It wasn't like we're doing a study on Native representation. And they were given a bunch of photographs of like neutral things, of like landscapes and like various like neutral sort of things that didn't have the weight. And then slipped in would be the images of Pocahontas or Chief Wahoo. And they were given a self-esteem measure before and after. They also did other ones of like community worth, like how valuable is my community, how much does my community have the ability to be successful, and had students generate lists of possible selves. So they'd say like, what can you be when you grow up? And they'd have them sort of list things out. And for both of those measures, it went down as well for Native students. So it's a really well-designed study where it took into account a lot of the potential sort of interactions of outside influences. And one thing that I think is really interesting is that with the self-esteem measures, for the students who said that mascot images didn't bother them, like the Native students were like, the ones who were like, no, it doesn't bother me, I don't care about that at all, their self-esteem actually went down more than the students who said, yeah, I see a problem with it. And Dr. Freiberg has theorized that the students who already can articulate that they feel like there's something wrong with it have built up sort of defense mechanisms to be able to deal with those constant affronts, where the students who say like it doesn't bother them haven't had those conversations to be able to build it up. So the study was really groundbreaking in the ways that it was able to terse apart like a lot of these kind of smaller parts of it that go into it and and I love it because it's a way that data can really make change, because people for so long were arguing that mascots didn't matter at all, and then finally along came this study, and now we can say like, no, this actual like peer-reviewed psychological study that went through all the checks that a normal psych study goes through has shown us these actual results to see, show that it actually is harming our students.
Who's driving the conversation around issues like the mascot issue? You mentioned that the internet has become a platform for Native peoples. Are Native peoples driving the conversation that these mascots are an issue, or how are these conversations getting started?
Yeah, definitely it is Native peoples now. I think there was this one phone survey done in 2002 that had 765 participants, and it was the last question of a 11-question phone survey that was asking all about the NFL, and the last one said, for the people who identified as Native American, does the name of the football team in Washington, or is the name of the football team in Washington offensive, or does it not bother you? Which is, to me, not two sides of the same coin. And of that phone survey, 90% of the self-identified Native people said that they weren't offended by the mascot. And that survey has been used since 2002 to sort of dismiss any activism by Native peoples by saying that 90% of Native Americans support the languages usually support the name, even though the question was not phrased that way. So 765 random football fans have stood in for all Native people. So finally, the tides have sort of started to shift and people are listening. And I think it's because of the success of like hashtags on Twitter, like Not Your Mascot has been a huge one, and being able to show the sort of collective voice that exists rather than it being these pockets of, like, because this activism is not new. It's been going on since the 60s and 70s with American Indian movement groups, but it's been pockets of on-the-ground kind of activism, and now the internet has allowed for these voices to really proliferate. And the interesting thing is a lot of people sometimes critique that the most outspoken voices are natives who live off reservation, who are, and the conversation then becomes like, aren't real Indians, like aren't the ones that are in their communities. But the reality is when you live on the reservation, you're surrounded by thousands of counter representations, of counter narratives. So when you see that football logo on TV, you turn to your couch and there are 15 people sitting there watching with you who don't look like that, and you know that Native people don't look like that. But when you're someone who lives in a community of largely non-natives, and you see the ways that non-natives are interacting with this mascot, when they're painting their faces, when they're tomahawk chopping, when they're saying scalp the Indians, or whatever it is, then that's when it becomes really real. And so I think there's not as big of a divide between the communities as people think. It's just the reality of context and of where you're living and the ways that you see people interacting with those mascots. Because no one's ever gonna go to a reservation community, I hope, go to a reservation community dressed like the way that they do when they go to the football game. That just is not gonna happen.